What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL Week 5.
Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over the wide receiver position and give you my 2019 fantasy football starts and sits for NFL Week 5. And we will show you how to use the Draft Dashboard tools to dominate your season-long fantasy leagues. You can find waiver wire targets, get player point projections, find the best positional matchups. These tools will help you decide what players to start in your fantasy football leagues. And these tools will help you dominate DFS and help you create winning DraftKings and FanDuel lineups. We have it all right here, so let's get into it. Okay guys, Week 5 fantasy football. I'm starting Marquise Brown from the Baltimore Ravens playing the Pittsburgh Steelers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they give up the 9th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Marquise Brown has averaged 12.9 fantasy points per game on the season in an average of 8.5 targets per game. He's struggled the past couple games, only scoring 4 and 6 fantasy points, but he's on the field for 59% of the snaps and he's touching the ball 19% of that time. He's projected at 10.3 fantasy points here in Week 5, and he's got a nice matchup versus a weak passing defense in the Steelers. So I like Marquise Brown here versus the Pittsburgh Steelers. Another guy I'm starting at wide receiver if I got him, despite a bad performance last week, is Tyler Boyd from the Cincinnati Bengals playing the Arizona Cardinals, who have the second worst defense overall in their middle-of-the-pack defending opposing wide receivers. Tyler Boyd has scored 10.5 fantasy points per game on the season. He gets an average of 9.5 pass targets per game. He only scored 5 fantasy points last game, but it wasn't all his fault. Andy Dalton was getting sacked left and right. He didn't have time to connect with Tyler Boyd, but that shouldn't be the case this week against a much weaker Arizona defense. He's on the field for 85% of the snaps. He touches the ball 17% of the time. He's projected at 12.9 fantasy points here in Week 5. So I'm starting Tyler Boyd here versus the Arizona Cardinals. Another guy who's just coming back from injury. He performed pretty well in his first game back last week. I'm starting Alshon Jeffrey from the Philadelphia Eagles playing the New York Jets, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, but they give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Alshon Jeffrey is averaging 10.3 fantasy points per game on the season. He gets an average of 5.3 pass targets per game. He got 9 pass targets last game, scored 11 fantasy points. He's on the field for 53% of the snaps and touches the ball 15% of that time. He's projected at 11.1 fantasy points here in Week 5. This is a home game for Alshon Jeffrey. He's had 2 weeks to heal up. He had a good performance last week. So I'm starting Alshon Jeffrey here versus the New York Jets.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching.
If you want to enter the drawing for $100 PayPal,
All you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won.
and then we'll send you $100 PayPal.
So it's that easy.
And we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video.
So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Now you might be worried about this next guy because he's got a new quarterback, Chase Daniels, at the helm. But I'm starting Allen Robinson from the Chicago Bears playing the Oakland Raiders, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they give up the 6th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Allen Robinson averages 10 fantasy points per game on the season in an average of 8.5 pass targets per game. So lots of volume. He scored 11 fantasy points last week. He's on the field for 91% of the snaps, and he touches the ball 14% of the time. He's projected to get 11.4 fantasy points here in Week 5, and he's got a juicy matchup versus a weak Oakland Raiders defense. So I'm starting Allen Robinson here versus the Oakland Raiders. Another guy that had a bum week last week. He's been underperforming, but don't shy away from him. I'm starting Adam Thielen from the Minnesota Vikings versus the New York Giants, who have the 6th worst defense overall, and they give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Adam Thielen averages 10.6 fantasy points per game on the season. He's getting an average of 5.5 targets per game, and he only scored 2 fantasy points last week. He's on the field for 93% of the snaps, and he touches the ball 10% of that time. He's projected at 12.3 fantasy points here in week 5. This is a fantastic matchup versus the New York Giants defense with a hungry Adam Thielen. I think he gets into the end zone this week and has a pretty good fantasy day. So I'm starting Adam Thielen here versus the New York Giants.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL, MLB is still going, NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay guys, fantasy football, week 5. Who are we sitting? I'm sitting Paul Richardson from the Washington Redskins playing the New England Patriots, who have the absolute best defense overall, and they give up the absolute fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Paul Richardson is averaging 9 fantasy points per game on 6 targets per game. He only scored 3 fantasy points last week. They've got some quarterback problems over there in Washington. He's only projected at 7.2 fantasy points here in week 5, and it could be half that. The New England Patriots defense is no joke, so I'm sitting Paul Richardson here versus the New England Patriots. Another guy in a bad matchup that I'm going to sit this week is Randall Cobb from the Dallas Cowboys playing the Green Bay Packers, who have the 7th best defense overall, and they give up the 2nd fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Randall Cobb is averaging 7.5 fantasy points per game on the season in an average of 5.3 targets per game. He's projected at 6.4 fantasy points here in week 5. It's a tough matchup versus Green Bay. They've been excellent this year on defense. You might want to play him because of the revenge narrative, but I'm not going there. So I'm going to sit Randall Cobb here versus the Green Bay Packers. This next guy had a huge week last week, but I'm not point chasing. I'm going to sit A.J. Brown from the Tennessee Titans playing the Buffalo Bills, who have the 2nd best defense overall and give up the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. A.J. Brown is averaging 9.8 fantasy points per game on the season, but most of those came last week with a 23 fantasy point outburst. He's averaging 4.3 targets per game on the season, and he's projected at 7.5 fantasy points here in week 5. Buffalo's a tough defense, and I think this guy's a bust after a boom week last week. So I'm sitting A.J. Brown here versus the Buffalo Bills. The next guy I'm going to sit is Terrell Williams from the Oakland Raiders playing the Chicago Bears, who have the 3rd best defense overall and give up the 9th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Terrell Williams is averaging 13.5 fantasy points per game on the season. He's been a consistent producer, averaging 6 targets per game, but he's banged up now. He's questionable this week, and he's squaring off against a tough Chicago defense, so he's going to have a hard time scoring points. So I'm going to sit Terrell Williams in a bad matchup here versus the Chicago Bears. Another guy I'm going to sit this week is Mike Williams from the LA Chargers playing the Denver Broncos, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, but they give up the 4th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Mike Williams is averaging 6.6 fantasy points per game on the season in an average of 5 targets per game. He's projected at 7.8 fantasy points here in week 5, but he's a little banged up from last week. He's questionable, so I'm going to pass on Mike Williams here versus the Denver Broncos.
Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smiggity smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite
player for this NFL slate.
I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again and good luck.
Do you want more fantasy football picks? Check out the video linked right in the middle of the screen. If you got any value from this video, please tap that subscribe button before you get out of here and ring that bell notification so you won't miss our daily fantasy football uploads. We're putting out new videos every day, so I don't want you guys to miss any of our free content.